Such a relationship, what is its precise nature? Because that's really quite important and it's going to impact upon the amount of money which it may or may not cost you. Is it that this person has become sensitized to something in their workplace and that they are now asthmatic, but they wouldn't have been asthmatic if that hadn't been for that sensitizing agent in their workplace? Or is it alternatively that they would have been asthmatic in any case, but that because of their working experiences and environment, they have had worsened symptoms of asthma to a degree that they wouldn't have had if they hadn't been working in that environment, the environment of your insured? In other words, did the work cause the asthma, or did it make pre-existing asthma worse? So I'm going to try and set out some basic principles, explode some myths, and try and help you understand the medical aspects of what's being alleged when you encounter either an employer's liability or a PL claim. So let's start off with those basic principles. And the very first one to address is to ask ourselves, what is asthma? What is asthma? Well, the answer often comes back, it's an allergy. It's not. Asthma is an allergic, inflammatory condition of the bronchi, the tubes carrying air in and out of the lungs. Well, what's inflammation? The next time you have a sore throat, look at it in the mirror. That's an inflamed throat. That's inflammation. And at the cellular, the microscopic level, we're going to see all sorts of changes, including the presence of special so-called inflammatory cells, special white blood cells, which have been brought there by blood vessels which are dilated, which are larger than normal, and that's why inflamed surfaces look pinker or redder than usual. So asthma is not an allergy, it's an inflammatory process. But what causes that inflammatory process? Well, an allergy is indeed one of those causes, but just one of them. And there are others, including, of course, those cases where we don't know why somebody has developed asthma. Let's take a step to one side and make sure we are clear in our minds about what an allergy is. Well, the term implies the involvement of the body's immune system. We've got to have an immune system or we die very quickly. And in fact, there are babies who are born with major defects in their immune systems and who do die very quickly. We need an immune system to protect us against things which the body recognizes as foreign, as being non-self. And principally, of course, it's quite easy to move these slides inadvertently, isn't it? Principally, of course, that's invading bacteria and viruses we're talking about. But also, and this is often forgotten, abnormal mutated cells emerging in our own bodies. We've all got today, every single person in this room has got vast numbers of cancer cells in their bodies, which have emerged today or yesterday. But they're being recognized by our immune system as odd, as non-self, and they're being killed off by our immune defenses. And people who are immunosuppressed get increased rates of cancers as well as getting increased rates of infection by bacteria and viruses that wouldn't affect someone with a normal immune system. But it's when the immune system overreacts that we have the manifestations of allergic disease. Allergies have gone up, and what is now becoming increasingly clear is that something that was just a kite being flown 20 years ago, called the hygiene hypothesis, probably is true. We're too clean these days, so our immune systems have not got enough to do. And so when they do get exposed to something foreign, they react vigorously because they haven't been, if you like, desensitized to it as time has gone by previous experience. I think doctors are better aware of this actually than most people. I remember being many years ago in the bar at St Thomas's Hospital, the student bar, and it was the usual filthy student bar, floor covered in crisp, God knows what. And there was one of the registrars had brought in his 3 or 4-year-old son who in a fit of temper threw his packet of crisps to the floor and stamped on it. And his dad said, "Now just you eat all those up," okay? So doctors are generally speaking dirtier and we have fewer allergies. But some very interesting research has been done to show, for instance, that if you take a population that's got a very high risk genetically of becoming allergic, and then you keep them in dirty conditions, and the Amish population in the USA, who've got very high genetic predisposition to cause of getting allergic problems, but because they use horses and work on the land, and all the kids are brought up playing around in the stables, they've got virtually no allergy. Whereas other analogous populations with the same genetic predisposition, who don't get the exposure by mucking around in the stables when they're small, they get lots of allergies. So it's when the immune system overreacts that we get these manifestations of allergic disease. We're all exposed to pollen every spring. In some people, there's an inherited tendency to overreact to this foreign, non-self substance. When the pollen hits their eyes, the immune overreaction causes itchy and watering eyes. When it hits the nose, the immune overreaction causes swelling of the lining of the nose and the secretion of fluid. I've never in my life had this allergic response, this immune system overreaction that we call hay fever, but many people here will have done so. But back to asthma. The consequences of this airways inflammation are a bit like what happens in the nose with hay fever, even when the cause of the asthma is not an allergic reaction. There's increased swelling of mucus, the swelling of the membrane lining the bronchial tubes, and both of these are going to narrow the space down the middle. I hardly dare press this. Oh, there we are. Narrow the space down the middle of the bronchial tube through which the air is flowing in and out of the lung. But crucially, though, there are muscles around the bronchial tubes arranged in a circular fashion. If I shorten a linear muscle, my biceps, which is attached there, it does that. If you shorten something which is circularly arranged, it does that. So the muscles go into spasm, and you get a greatly narrowed lumen through which the person's trying to breathe. The bronchi get narrowed. Well, this of course makes breathing more difficult. It's harder to push anything, air or water, through a narrow tube than through a wide tube. The asthmatic has to work harder to breathe, and they feel breathless. The air being pushed through these narrow tubes makes a whistling sound, and hundreds of individual whistles makes the wheeziness that we associate with asthma. And the excessive secretions, with some other mechanisms, make them cough. But how does this impact upon the workplace and damp homes? Well, very broadly, we can identify two sorts of people with asthma, those with the clear allergic trigger and those without. And those with a clear allergic trigger will often have the very same allergic trigger affecting their nose. So as well as asthma, they've got allergic rhinitis, Latin rhino, nose, itis, inflammation. And very many occupational and household claims are going to be for rhinitis as well as for asthma. But, and very importantly, both these broad sorts of asthmatics share a common feature. I'm not asthmatic. If I inhale a high enough concentration of an irritant, though, I'll cough. Higher still a concentration, and I'll get narrowing of my airways, just like an asthmatic, even though I'm not asthmatic. And every other non-asthmatic person in this room will do the same thing. An asthmatic, though, whether the origin of their problem is allergic or not, will develop such a response at a much lower concentration of that irritant than will a non-asthmatic. So whatever the cause of their condition, they'll exhibit non-specific hyperreactivity, overreactivity. And asthmatics, all of them, have got this. So let's take an asthmatic whose attacks are precipitated by an allergy to dogs or cats, or as we'll see in a second, to flour dust in the workplace. Let's now expose this asthmatic to a dusty environment with dust containing no dog or cat proteins. That asthmatic is likely to respond with cough and wheeze at levels of dustiness which would not trouble me as a non-asthmatic. Make it dusty enough and I will indeed respond, but only at those higher levels. So in the dusty workplace, the person whose asthma is actually precipitated by an allergy to cats or dogs, in a dusty workplace, they're going to get symptoms of asthma. The same is going to apply to an asthmatic whose asthma is not due to an allergy. He will also cough and wheeze in the dusty environment at levels of dust that would not trouble me. He's not allergic to the dust. Indeed, he's not allergic to anything at all. But as an asthmatic, he will exhibit this non-specific bronchial hyperresponsiveness. So let's put asthmatic into the dusty workplace. In fact, let's put them both into the dusty workplace. They're going to cough and wheeze at levels of dustiness which will not trouble their non-asthmatic workmates. But is this true occupational asthma? Actually, strictly it's not. Occupational asthma, I repeat, is asthma which has been caused by the working environment. What we've just been discussing are two asthmatics whose pre-existing asthma, which they had in any case, was worsened, was exacerbated by their working environment, or as the Health and Safety Executive calls it now, work-aggravated asthma. True occupational asthma is always allergic asthma, and I'm going to come on to some exceptions to that. the individual's immune system becomes sensitized to an agent in the workplace. And this sensitization may take months or years before it becomes manifest. And the first manifestations may indeed be occupational rhinitis before asthmatic symptoms occur. But once sensitized, though, smaller and smaller exposures will be enough to trigger symptoms. And I dealt with a nurse who developed a latex allergy from the gloves used in the operating theatre. And her latex allergy became so severe that she had a serious asthmatic reaction when she went into a McDonald's where there was a kids' party and a couple of kids were banging balloons together, because balloons are made of latex. Now, once you've got this problem, it may resolve after leaving the responsible industry, but it doesn't always do so. And the consequences of that for claims we're going to come on to. Here are some of the commonest causes: flour and grain, isocyanates, enzymes, wood dusts, cutting oils and coolants. A fairly recently recognised one. Flour and grain is really very common indeed. I was involved in a case recently, and in the con, the client said, but we're organic. You know, these are natural products. We're organic. Mother Nature's bounty. And I said, well, okay, well, let's talk about some other natural things, you know. Arsenic, cyanide, strychnine, radioactivity, asbestos, okay, all natural products. So just because it's natural, just because it's organic, does not mean it's safe. So here we've got a case of, inverted commas, occupational asthma. Is it really? After what we've been talking about for the last couple of minutes, we should be asking ourselves the question, is this a person who is having an allergic reaction to a workplace exposure and has become asthmatic, or is it a person who is asthmatic in any case and is manifesting non-specific bronchial hyperactivity? But details of how we're going to try and distinguish those is beyond the time constraints of this talk, but it's very important to try and do so. If you've got someone with true occupational asthma, they're going to carry that disadvantage with them after leaving your client's employment. He can never work in the same industry again. Just as important, if he continues to be asthmatic, then his non-specific bronchial hyperreactivity, which he's also got because he's an asthmatic, may limit him in other future jobs, even if those future jobs do not involve him in exposure to the original offending agent. By contrast, the chap who's asthmatic in any case and was just made temporarily worse by the dusty workplace, he retains that disadvantage when he leaves that workplace and tries to work somewhere else that is dusty, but that disadvantage is part of his makeup and was not caused by the conditions in your client's workplace. And these are principles which we're going to try and keep in mind when we talk in just a second about damp housing claims. But having looked at the development of sensitization and in the workplace and how it can lead to true occupational asthma, and having differentiated it from work aggravated asthma, let's look at a rarer cause of true occupational asthma, and that is massive acute irritant exposure. If you're in a chemical works and something goes wrong and you get a lung full of chlorine gas, then you're going to be very unwell straight away. But if you recover, you may well be left with a permanent asthma-like illness. Now, there are differences in terminology to discuss this. Reactive airways dysfunction syndrome, RADS, tends to be used in the USA. Irritant-induced asthma tends to be used in this country, but there's quite a bit of crossover. But the effect on your life is just the same as if you become sensitized and develop the more usual type of true occupational asthma. You're disadvantaged now and you're disadvantaged in the future, and that disadvantage results from the nastiness that went on at your client's premises. Now finally, a very controversial issue. We're happy with massive acute irritant exposure, but what about long-term low-level irritant exposure? These are people who've got no history of the sudden dramatic severe irritant response like that which we've just been discussing. Instead, they've had months or years of lower level exposure, not enough to cause those severe acute symptoms. Can they develop asthma attributable to their work? My feeling is that there probably is an increased risk of being asthmatic in at least some such populations. but there's no evidence to suggest that it is a more than doubling of risk. And so by the common law test of the balance of probabilities, you cannot say that in any individual case, the person would probably not have been asthmatic, but for their working environment. Now, all those concepts lead us into the area of damp housing. Is there an association between damp housing and respiratory tract symptoms? The simple answer is yes, there is. But let's clear up a couple of points. First of all, is it the damp itself? No, it's probably not the damp itself. It's probably the presence of organisms growing because the damp environment allows them to flourish. These may be bacteria, or particularly they may be fungi. What's the difference between a mould and a fungus? A mould is a type of fungus. So all moulds are fungi, not all fungi are moulds. All chickens are birds, but not all birds are chickens. So when people are talking about fungal infestation in a property or mould infestation in the property, they're talking about the same thing. Yeasts are single-celled fungi. Moulds strictly a fungi formed of a network of branching cells. You wouldn't call a mushroom a fungus, a mould, but it is a fungus. So let's look at epidemiological evidence. Let's look at evidence derived from studying large groups of people. If you take a large number of people living in damp housing and compare them with a large number of people not living in damp housing, you're going to find more people with respiratory symptoms in the damp housing group than in the dry housing group. And this is true particularly of children. I'm going to look at that in a bit more detail, but the word detail comes with a health warning because I'm still going to be talking in generalizations. Let's look at it by putting and answering a few questions. Is a child who has asthma, who moves to a damp flat with mould present, either visible or you can smell the mould, are they likely to have symptoms of asthma that are worse than they would otherwise have been had they not moved to that damp flat? Yes, they are more likely. But you can't say with complete confidence in any individual case that it did actually happen to that child, because children's asthma gets better, it gets worse anyway. So they're more likely to get a worsening, but you can't say when looking at an individual that it did with them with confidence. Consider now a child who does not have asthma and who moves to a damp flat. Is their risk of developing symptoms of asthma for the first time increased? Yes, it is. But considering that same child, and imagine they did actually become asthmatic, could you say that had they not moved to that damp flat, they would probably, that is to say more than 50% likely, not have become asthmatic at all? Well, that's much more difficult. I interpret the figures as suggesting a level of increase in risk that would not allow you to make that jump. Of course, if we accept there is an increased risk, and there is, then it must be the case that some of these children who are now asthmatic would not have been asthmatic had they not moved to the damp house. The trouble is, in any individual case, you don't know which they are. You don't know whether it was that one or one of the others. And only if you have a more than doubling of risk for the population as a whole can you take any one child and say, I cannot of course tell for sure about Mary here, but the figures for the whole population suggest that she probably wouldn't have asthma if she hadn't been in this damp flat. So first-time symptoms of asthma in children, worsening of symptoms in children who already have asthma, good epidemiologic evidence that dampness does cause that. Attribution in any individual case, this child did, that child didn't, is really very much more difficult. So medicine would say the risk of developing asthma was increased, and that's what I say. And the law is going to say, was the risk more than doubled? If it was, they were less than 50% likely to have become asthmatic if they hadn't moved there. So it was probably the damp. Whether it actually comes to that in most cases, I'm by no means so sure, and others will tell you more about that. But adults, a broadly similar approach, but with a little less confidence. The association is there exactly as with children, but the evidence is just a little less strong. So how might you handle a claim from a medical point of view? And I'm saying from a medical point of view. Well, first of all, don't automatically start off from a position of skepticism. You know, the claimant, they might even be telling the truth, I know, but they really might be. You certainly need to look for a pattern of illness and one that's supported by the medical records. You need to, whether look a child or an adult, the person should certainly be attending their GP, and ideally from the point of view of handling a claim, when this is from the claimant's point of view as well as the defendant's point of view, ideally they'll be under hospital care with good documentation. What's the chronology? Does it fit with possible causation or more likely exacerbation? And beware of overdiagnosis of asthma in children. It used to be desperately underdiagnosed, with asthmatic children being labelled absurdly as having chronic bronchitis. And the pendulum then swung too far the other way, with children with a single episode of viral-associated wheeze getting the label asthmatic. We're beginning now to get back to a more sensible and balanced approach, but probably asthma is still being overdiagnosed. But also ask yourself, in a practical and pragmatic way, what were the conditions like? If I think back over the last 3 cases of alleged respiratory illness caused by damp housing in which I have reported, it's become clear that the housing, the damp and the mould infestation were disgracefully bad. Some pictures are actually not from my cases. And if a judge is told correctly that there's an association between damp and respiratory symptoms, then even if there's not proof of a more than doubling of risk, if the judge sees appalling photographs like this, the medic says you're going to lose. I mean, the lawyer may say you're not, but the medic says you're going to lose. So look at the totality of the picture rather than starting with a position of skepticism and looking for a hole, any hole in the medical evidence. Now finally, what about toxic mould syndrome? As well as causing allergic effects, some moulds can produce toxic compounds called mycotoxins, and the most commonly cited example is Stachybotrys chartarum, and that's a black mould which is pretty common in damp conditions. That's Stachybotrys chartarum. I discovered it fairly recently in our washing machine when taking the tray out, which has got that you put the detergent into, and then underneath it, it was ghastly black mould, which is clearly this stuff. Shares how often either myself or my wife take the tray out of the... And so toxic mould. Now, massive exposure to mycotoxins can indeed have very serious health effects. But I think it would be widely agreed in informed circles that there's been no well-validated example of such an event occurring in the context of damp housing. There have been suggestions of the involvement of mycotoxins in so-called sick building syndrome, where significant numbers of workers in a building are apparently affected by low-grade and non-specific symptoms. But there are plenty of other candidates for that sort of symptoms, including, it's very well recognised, low staff morale, and there's been no definitive demonstration of the role of mould. So it's a very ill-defined entity. It's alleged to cause non-specific and wide-ranging symptoms, and I think you can sum it up by saying it's medically controversial except in very rare circumstances. So what are our take-home messages? Well, first of all, has the asthma been caused by the workplace? Or would the asthma have been present in any case been made worse by the workplace? If it's caused, what was the mechanism? Usually sensitisation. Our chap's working in the bakery. Occasionally it's the sudden high-level irritant exposure. Chemical works, factories where there's a blast of irritant fumes. Long-term low-level irritant exposure, still very controversial. Damp and mould, they are bad for health, probably particularly in children. And we ask ourselves the same question with the damp housing case. Has the asthma been caused by the home, or has the asthma, which would have been present in any case, been made worse by the home? And unlike in the workplace, cause is very difficult to prove in any one individual. Worsening is, I think, easier and more likely to be readily accepted by the court, particularly if there are photographs documenting bad problems. But that's a medical view and not a legal one. If you've got symptoms due to the houses, they really ought to be readily documented in the medical records. But coming back to the toxic mould syndrome, and you also get these sort of things alleged sometimes in damp housing generally, alleged non-respiratory effects need very careful review indeed and are unlikely to be supported by medical evidence. So that was a rapid gallop through. I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much. I'm answering questions later. I am, aren't I?
Yeah, I think we'll try and get the three of you. No, there's going to be loads for John, so I thought what we'll do, we'll get the three of them to, and after Jenny has spoken about carbon monoxide, I'd actually quite like John to actually contribute to the carbon monoxide. I know Nick was raring to go there. I've just stopped him. He's upset. So. Yeah, write it down. Don't forget, I'm sure it was a wonderful question. So Claire's now going to talk us through housing, disrepair, the personal injury. Obviously, John has had a look very at the toxic mould and the damp, and so will Claire. But Claire will also look at other kinds of conditions, i.e. stress, I assume, because we do get a lot of other claims, not from housing, not just on damp. I mean, we've had a number of rat infestation claims where it's led to some interesting conditions, but of course including stress. So I hand you over to Claire, who's a partner in our Manchester office, who's now ready to go.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, Dr. Morgillan has kindly taken us through the condition of asthma, how this is affected by exposures in the workplace, at home and by other environments. I'm going to have a look at the context of asthma claims that we see on a day-to-day basis, where we've seen a shift in the number of those cases being presented, and where we think claimants listers are going to be focusing going forward. I've been with BLM for over 17 years, and certainly for the last 12 years I've been solely dealing with occupational disease and asthma claims, and I wanted just to initially to have a look at the historical data in terms of the type of cases that have been coming through. Now, this is a table setting out reports that have been made to SWORD, which is the Surveillance of Work-Related Occupational Respiratory Disease, and it is a project that's run by Manchester University and requires consultants, namely chest physicians, to report various different conditions to them in terms of asthma and what the sensitizers were, so they can gather data as to what type of sensitizers are still causing problems. The second half of the table is the industrial injuries disablement benefit stats, which essentially shows what type of claims are being presented and what claimants are succeeding in recovering benefits in terms of asthma that they may have developed in the workplace. I find the SWORD statistics more realistic in terms of looking at where the trends are, partially because the industrial injuries disablement benefit, there's certain types of categories that claimants have to satisfy to be able to claim those benefits. So those statistics are a little bit skewed by those factors. So, as John mentioned earlier, the majority of asthma cases that are presented are sensitization. And essentially, looking at this table, you will see that flour grain, isocyanates, wood dust, and cutting oils and coolants, they are the key issues that are occurring in the workplace from a respiratory sensitization perspective, and key substances that employers really do have a duty to ensure that exposure is either prevented or adequately controlled. Now, the highest percentage of cases that are reported relate to flour dust. And looking ahead, I do consider that this is going to continue to increase. The reason I say this is because a large number of bakeries in the UK instruct me to deal with cases from letter of claim stage through the litigation stage, in addition to not just seeing cases from the litigation point onwards. So I've sort of got first-hand knowledge in terms of what type of cases are being presented and how they're being presented and where the triggers are. Now, in terms of flour dust exposure, historically it was always the smaller bakeries where the claims were presented, because in some respects a lot of the baking was done by hand. There was always going to be exposure to flour, and essentially they constituted a large amount of the asthma cases that we dealt with. At the time, obviously, larger bakeries, they have the resources to be able to store flour in silos, pipe it directly into the mixers, and you've got employees not coming into contact with flour. What's changed is that obviously there is now this theme and trend for artisan breads, sandwich alternatives, and the larger companies are now operating in a different way to what they did before. That may be the sprinkling of flour on top of a loaf when it's being cooked and come out of the oven, but the sprinkling of that flour gives rise to flour dust within the area of the bakery. Further to that, particularly when you're looking at wraps and various other products, they're not actually going through the procedure as you would traditionally put a loaf through, where the dough goes into the tray, goes into the oven, is cooked. These products are run on long strips of dough which go along conveyor belts. Now, to stop that dough from sticking to the conveyor, they have to dust it with flour. So what I'm finding is that whilst I'm acting for a large varied amount of bakeries, I'm finding that far more cases are coming from the larger bakeries now, simply because they've changed the way they work and the amount of flour that is available. In addition to that, Thompson's won the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union nomination, and certainly over the last 3 to 4 years, from a short tail perspective, I've seen a lot more cases coming through, a lot of the asthma cases as well. So I think essentially that is going to be a key area going forward. Moving on to irritant-induced asthma. John has already explained essentially that irritant-induced asthma, some experts think it occurs, some don't. In terms of RADS, I think there's no real debate about that, because essentially we've got an employee or a human being exposed to significant quantities of a chemical which can have a significant impact on the airways. In terms of lower levels of substances over a long period of time, that's a little tenuous in terms of whether there's a link there, and there's a lot of experts who do not think irritant-induced asthma, certainly from that perspective, is viable. In terms of irritant-induced asthma, certainly over the last 12 months, I have seen an increase in diesel fume cases, primarily coming from the Midlands area. The cases tend to be warehouse environments where HGVs are coming in to load, unload products. You've got diesel-run forklift trucks in the warehouses. You've got a considerable amount of diesel fume in the area. Certainly, historically, we tended to see those cases in the bus depots, train depots, where there's a significant amount of buses maybe starting up in the mornings, giving rise to significant levels of diesel fume. But we're now starting to see quite a lot of different cases now. It's not really a surprise to me that a lot of the claimants that I'm dealing with at the moment are actually in the Birmingham Midlands area. The Birmingham Chest Clinic essentially focuses as part of their service in research. Professor Burge, who has now retired, he has focused on finding respiratory sensitizers. That has been his key role at the Birmingham Chest Centre. And essentially, they're constantly coming up with diagnosis of occupational asthma, which is extremely unhelpful to employers when they send their employees to a chest centre and they're being told that they've got occupational asthma due to exposure to diesel fume, when clearly the HSE have not indicated that that is a factor or a problem in that regard. So essentially, I think there is a tendency for more of these cases to come. The reason I say that as well is that many claimant solicitors in the past never appreciated the fact that Regulation 7.7 applies to diesel fume. Regulation 7 essentially requires adequate control of exposure if exposure can't be prevented. If, however, the substance is something that could cause cancer, does cause cancer, or is a respiratory sensitizer, that obligation is to reduce the risk of injury to the lowest level reasonably practicable. Now, because diesel fume is a carcinogen, it isn't a sensitizer but a carcinogen, those regulations apply in those cases, and bizarrely, I have had cases where claimants are now alive to that issue and referring to the fact that there is a significant obligation on all these logistics companies where there is diesel fume in the workplace to really take some significant steps to reduce the risk much further. John mentioned work-aggravated asthma. Now, I'm sure that's a popular scene in many workplaces. It certainly is in our office at the moment, where people can't seem to get the right temperature that's acceptable to them. But what was interesting is obviously asthma's always been a hot topic for the HSE. Over the years, they've spent a significant amount of resource working with industries, working with their trade associations, and essentially trying to minimise occupational asthma. It has significant effects. Asthma attacks can lead to death, and it's been a very, very big focus for them. Because of that, they've sort of steered away from the other aspects of asthma and how asthma is affected in the workplace. And in 2014, because they didn't feel they knew enough about how work impacts on people with pre-existing asthma, they asked HSL to prepare a report named A Review of Reviews. And essentially, they asked HSL to look at all the data that's available in terms of what sort of factors in the workplace are causing problems with asthma. It came out with some very, very interesting facts. 7% of the adult population have asthma. Says further to that, following research papers, that 1 in 5 workers have work-aggravated asthma, so they're affected in some way by the work that they undertake. Now, a lot of the causes of aggravated asthma are exposure to inhaled irritants, as John mentioned earlier, and essentially those are the type of cases that we've got historically. But what the report also highlighted was that emotional stress, workplace temperatures, and physical activities can actually have an impact on asthma and cause an aggravation of that. Recently, following on from this report, we have seen some exacerbation cases involving exertion in the workplace. We've had some cases as well that are focusing on cold storage, and suspect most definitely that this is an area for growth. Certainly the statistics that are quoted in that report give rise to quite a blatant concern that there are a significant amount of people whose work is aggravating their pre-accident asthma. Okay. So stress was highlighted in the report, and certainly over the last couple of years I have seen a number of cases with an overlap with asthma and stress. Indeed, most recently I've had a couple of cases where it was an asthma case and a stress case, and there was no sensitizer. Nobody could actually work out why this gentleman was getting asthma type symptoms, and inevitably it turned out that he was suffering from anxiety and hyperventilation. If you look at the symptoms of panic disorder, which are very, very similar to asthma, you'll see that these types of conditions, anxiety, stress in the workplace, difficulty breathing, rapid or shallow breathing, chest pain, distress, these are all the types of things that you see when people are having asthma problems, and it's easy for a misdiagnosis to be made. So certainly that is a factor that most definitely plays a part in terms of work-aggravated asthma. So moving on to housing disrepair and asthma, we've seen a significant increase recently in disease claims arising out of housing disrepair. But why is this? Well, properties fall into disrepair for a number of reasons, including their age, tenant neglect, tenants failing to report problems, but also a failure on part of the landlord to or the local authority to maintain the property appropriately. In times of recession and public sector austerity, essentially the funding and resources that are available to ensure that housing stock repair and maintenance is lacking, and inevitably claims will follow from that. The recent cost reforms in personal injury matters have caused claimant solicitors as well to look for new sources of revenue that don't operate within the fixed fee regime that Michelle was talking about earlier. By adding a personal injury element to a housing disrepair case, it's possible to avoid the fixed cost portal. PL disease doesn't go through the portal, and it's a very good source of income for people wanting to pursue cases in that regard. Legal aid has also diminished, certainly for the last few years, and forced claimants to look for alternative types of funding. Obviously, people living in social housing are usually on low income, so they're focusing on no-win, no-fee agreements, essentially, to fund their cases, and certainly that's going to give rise to these cases increasing. As John advised earlier, it is a common constitutional condition both in adults and children, and essentially it is established that living in damp conditions with mould can affect the respiratory system, and therefore there's a significant amount of cases that we see coming through that are primarily exacerbation of pre-existing respiratory conditions, in addition to psychiatric responses, which may be psychological injuries occurring, but primarily aggravation of them as such. These cases are costly to defend. There's a number of key issues that come up in these cases. Policy coverage being the first question that you need to ask yourself when a case comes in. Most PL policies will cover a landlord for legal liability for damages and costs and bodily injury during the period of insurance. However, many policies have an exclusion for indemnity for loss, damage or liability for pollution or contamination. So unless it's caused by a sudden and unexpected accident which could be identified, essentially there is a concern that failure to maintain and look after that property is going to cause a problem with the application of that policy. Most policies do include a general term for insureds to ensure that they prevent loss and damage by keeping the property in good condition. Again, that gives rise to possible breaches of the policy conditions. So that is, very much a key issue. Essentially, if a claim has arisen due to failings on behalf of an insured to undertake suitable and sufficient maintenance and repairs, then it is a decision for you to make as to whether or not you want to indemnify them under that policy. Most of the insurers I work with tend to decide those on a case-by-case basis, dependent upon who the insured is and how important their business is to them. Another problem that comes up in relation to these types of cases, and Michelle mentioned it earlier, is litigants in person. We deal with far more litigants in person for these types of cases than the other asthma cases that we deal with. Litigants in person are notoriously difficult to deal with. Not only do they insist on ringing us every day, and are sometimes quite frankly abusive at times, the Law Society says we have to be nice to them. June 2015, the Law Society issued guidelines for lawyers when dealing with litigants in person. Due to legal aid cuts, the increase in the small claims limit and increase in court fees, the Law Society really felt that because of the amount of litigants in person that were entering the system, that really lawyers needed some guidance as to how to deal with them. Quite frequently, they have no understanding of the legal process, nor are they able to form an objective assessment of their own case and see the potential perhaps for settlement, unless obviously it's got several noughts on the end of it. So I think what is clear is that lawyers can't be seen to be taking advantages of litigants in person, and essentially judges are going to be bending over backwards at hearings, and obviously we always have to bear this in mind, and it has an impact on costs, certainly going forward. Both Michelle and John mentioned minors. Inevitably, in light of the nature of these claims, they're often multi-claimant. We see a lot of children's cases tagged on to the back of adult cases that are presented. They cause real difficulties sometimes in cases of this nature because there is a shortage of paediatric respiratory experts. Not every respiratory expert is willing to examine children. Often because the cases are so minor in value, the cost of actually getting a report from a respiratory physician will outweigh the damages that you might pay out in respect of that case. Often in cases of this nature, we do look at medical records, we analyse them. has there been an increase in medication during the period of the tenancy? Are we able to look at this, and if it's one that we think is to settle commercially, can we see enough evidence in the medical records to be able to justify making that small payment? With children, it is very, very difficult. I had a look at some statistics the other day, and it basically says that children who are preschool age have 9 colds per year. People who are kids in junior school have on average 12 a year. That's compared to 2 to 4 that adults have. So how do you differentiate between what is actually something that's caused in the home, or whether it is just generally children picking up illnesses as they do, as their immune system evolves to deal with that? So further to that, I think with minors as well, not all claimant solicitors are happy to agree a parental indemnity, where essentially you would agree to pay a sum of money, the parent signs a form off, you give them the money, and that's it. A lot of claimant solicitors, to protect themselves, are now wanting to make sure that there is court approval of any settlement that is agreed. So you then have to go through the process of issuing Part 8 proceedings and going down that route to get approval of what you've agreed in that case. So they're certainly interesting cases, but do involve a significant amount of work. Obviously, John has covered toxic mould extremely well in terms of causation and the issues that are around. What I just wanted to touch on in addition to that, I mean, I think it's safe to say that, you know, there are issues with regards to moulds and asthma, because essentially people can develop allergy to the moulds and react whilst exposed to it. So we've not really got an issue there, but obviously toxic mould syndrome is extremely controversial. And essentially what we want to be doing is making sure that these cases are robustly defended. Now, this is a case that was dealt with by our London and Manchester office collectively, and involved a gentleman called Jeff Charlton of Building Forensics. This is his list of apparent health risks which are associated with exposure to mould in the home. Quite a long list, quite a severe and significant risk in terms of the level and extent of injuries that may result from exposure to mould. He goes on to suggest that these are other mycotoxins that can be released by way of mould exposure, and that these are significant. One of the most potent carcinogens known to man, damage to kidneys, liver, and hemorrhaging of the brain and lungs. Bizarrely enough, a report was obtained from the Health Protection Agency. Their view was that there's been much media attention to the potential role of fungal mycotoxins in the development of ill health in water-damaged buildings. We're constantly exposed to thousands of fungal spores associated with mycotoxins when we go outdoors. And key, the only proven health effects of mycotoxins concern eating of food spoiled by very large numbers of fungi or continuous environmental exposure to enormous quantities of fungus. To date, there is no conclusive medical evidence that mycotoxins produced by any fungal species impact on human health via inhalation or skin contact. So you can see how there is significantly differing views between the assessment of certain experts, although I would have to say that the qualifications of Jeff Charlton leave a little to be desired. To be fair to him, in his report on a particular case, he does say, "I have no formal qualifications in building surveying, construction or medicine, and remarks are made for discussion purposes only." I don't think judges want to have a discussion about a case. They want to actually get some expert evidence to assist them in determining it. A party should enlist competent advice from specialists prior to any actions or decisions being made on the information provided in my report. But that said, he's been on the BBC, he's been on the ITV, he's been on Channel 4 as an expert in this field. He works with flood issues, often on the news. So whilst in essence there is a significant divergence between the opinions that he's expressing and those which experts, certainly in the UK, are expressing, we need to be careful. We need to nip this in the bud, and we need to make sure that essentially we're challenging his evidence consistently. Obviously, toxic mould and mould neurosity, it's an increasing common allegation in personal injury litigation in the US. Obviously, a lot of cases in litigation are led first in the US and tend to make their way over to us. So certainly, while some experts in the US are pushing this, one expert says in a recent report, essentially, although some experts in the USA will say, whilst it is increasingly common in litigation, I have to say it is conspicuously absent from the clinic. This is driven more by plaintiff lawyers than by scientific disagreements. So I think all in all, it isn't firmly established in the US, but essentially we may see it gracing our shores again in light of experts which are willing to give credence to those types of conditions.